It's my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual book launch for Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept by Kim Heikkila. My name is Kevin Lindsay, and I am the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. Minnesota's Humanities Center has the pleasure of working with Kim in the past on a program called Echoes of War. Kim's previous book was Sisterhood of War, Minnesota Women in Vietnam. But today, we're so pleased to talk about this book, Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. Kim is an independent scholar and president of Spotlight Oral History. She has also taught courses on U.S. history, U.S. women's history, the Vietnam, and the era of the 1960s at various colleges and universities in the Twin Cities. We're very fortunate to have Kim within our community. It is my pleasure now to have Kim visit me virtually on stage here. And if you can, welcome her by either putting in a clap or thumbs up on your screen and welcome Kim to the stage. Kim, welcome tonight.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, so much. I'm so pleased that you and the Minnesota Humanities Center, for whom I have such great respect, are part of this event along with the Minnesota Historical Society. And thank you to all of you who are out there tuning in from wherever you may be tuning in tonight. I'm happy to have you all here as well. I would also like to just say a few thanks before we start our conversation, because there are some other people and organizations that were really critical to the work that went into this book. First among those is the Minnesota Independent Scholars Forum. As it sounds, it is an organization that supports independent scholars such as myself, and they were instrumental in securing 2 legacy grants that helped fund my research for the book. It funded a research trip to the archives of the Salvation Army and the oral history interviews that I did. St. Catherine University also offered some research support for me to work with a student colleague a few summers ago on some research for the book. So I thank St. Catherine's as well. And then, of course, the most important people that I need to thank for this book and for their support of it are my family, my Moore family, my mother's family, and all of her relatives who were nothing but supportive during the writing of this book and as I was plying them with questions about our shared past. I'm especially grateful, of course, to my brother, Eric, who also gave his consent for me to kind of reveal our family history to some slice of the world. My husband, Steve, and son, too, are a part of this as well. And of course, my sister, Kim, who will be joining us here in a few minutes. In addition to them, I extend my deepest and most heartfelt thanks to the women I interviewed. The other women who spent time at Booth, 7 of whom had delivered their babies there, 1 of whom had worked as a Ramsey County caseworker, and 1 of whom had worked as a labor and delivery nurse, helping these young women through the delivery of their children. And I want to pay special tribute to 2 of them who are no longer with us, who have died since the book came out, or since the book was done anyway. And that is for Gay and June. So I pay special tribute to them. So thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Yes. And Kim, you alluded to the fact that you're going to have some special guests join us later, in which you will have a little bit of a conversation. I'd like to ask you a few questions just to get the night started, and then we can bring these guests up. And then for those of you in the virtual audience, if you have questions during the course of the first half of this conversation, please put those in the chat. And then at the end of the night, I'll be able to ask Kim some of those questions that you have during the course that come up to you. Sounds like we have a good plan, right? Okay.
Works for me.
So with that, Kim, how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, well, it was a long time in coming. I've been working on this book for a long time. And for me, the story, if not the book itself, really started in 1994, when I first learned that I had a sister that I had never known about. It was in 1994 that my sister Kim, and I'll let her tell this part of the story later, but she found my mother. My mother had given birth to her in 1961 at Booth Memorial Hospital. My mother had been single and pregnant, and like so many women of that time period, kind of was subject of a lot of scrutiny and stigma about being a single pregnant woman. So she had gone to Booth Memorial Hospital for the last couple of weeks of her pregnancy and delivered her baby there, and then surrendered her for adoption, and didn't talk about it for 33 years until 1994, when my sister found her, which prompted my mother to tell me and my brother Eric about this part of her past that we had no knowledge of at all. So that's when the story started for me. But in terms of turning it into a book, it didn't happen right away. Kim had been back in our lives for 15 or more years before I decided that I was going to turn this into any kind of research project or book. So I had published my first book in 2011. Sisterhood of War came out in 2011. And in the immediate aftermath of that book, I was trying to think about what I might do next, what the next project would be. And I remember going to an author talk by Hampton Sides. Hampton Sides was on a book tour at that time for his book called Hellhound on His Trail, which was about the pursuit of James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King. And I went to hear him speak about his book. And during the Q&A, somebody asked him how he came up with the ideas for his books. And he said, well, you don't have to travel to exotic locations. You don't have to look far and wide across the world to find a good subject to research and to write about. He said, look for the stories in your own backyard. And I thought, okay, well, what's in my own backyard? That was particularly helpful to me as an independent scholar who doesn't have research funding, readily available. I thought I need to do something that I can do here. So that was in maybe 2011 or 2012. My mother had died in 2009. So that was the other big impetus for this book. By that time, by 2011, 2012, I was still grieving her death, but it had become more manageable to me. And I thought, I was into motherhood at that point myself. My husband and I adopted our son in 2006. And I was really trying to figure out what I was doing as a mother. And I started wondering how my mother's first experience with pregnancy, that was so filled with shame and stigma and silence and secrecy, how that might have influenced her parenting of me and my own relationship to being a mother. So it was those three things where I just thought, okay, I think there's a story to be told here. I think I need to look into my mom's past to figure out something about her, something about myself, and something about a historical event or a situation that affected a generation of women across the country. And so it was that point where I thought, yes, I think, I'm gonna try to learn about my mom by turning to the archives and by asking other women who had this similar experience what their experiences were.
Well, I think all of us in Minnesota are very fortunate that you took that advice to tell the story from your own personal experience, your own backyard, because you have a great story that you have told here within the book. I appreciated the pictures of your mother as a baby up on the screen. This book is unique. I mean, you've woven interviews, biography. It's not sort of a straightforward, it's very well crafted and interwoven. Could you speak to a little bit of that, the challenge as a writer within that space and why you went this route?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It is a challenge. That was probably one of the biggest challenges of the book, was to try to figure out how to put all these pieces together into some kind of coherent whole. And the reason I decided to approach it from those many angles is because it tapped into those many different aspects of who I am. It was a very personal story. It was about my mother. It was about my family. I had wanted to do my next project. I wanted to be a little bit more personal than my first book had been, have a little more personal significance to me. And this certainly was that. So I had to explore it through my own experience as my mother's daughter and as a mother myself. My mother was also a very talented writer. She is a very beautiful writer. She made her career as a writer. And so I wanted to honor her words as well. So I've incorporated a significant amount of the 2 essays that she's written about her experience as an unwed mother. Those kind of guide the structure of the book, the chapters as they're laid out. And I'm an historian. So that's the other way I found an entry into understanding this past and into understanding my mother better, was to use the skills that I was trained to use. And so I went to the archives and I read the published scholarship. I looked at archival sources. I looked at media sources. And then I'm also an oral historian. And I thought, I can't ask my mother these questions, but maybe I can find some women who had similar experiences who would be willing to share them with me. And I can ask them the questions I wish I had asked my mother. And so all of those approaches were really central to me in trying to understand this kind of experience as a whole. And I couldn't set any one of them aside and feel like I had done the job. It was also a really good writing strategy, because if one kind of writing I was hitting a block, I could switch to a different kind of writing or a different kind of voice, and it would give me a new angle on that issue, and it would sometimes kickstart a new way of thinking about it that was really useful. So hopefully it works for readers. It is a challenging structure, and hats off to the designer who designed the book for the Minnesota Historical Society Press, because it is a beautifully designed book. And I think it's her design and structure that accommodates this kind of complicated structure of the book. So I'm so pleased with the design of the book.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because I was struck by the same, is that the design element within the book really accentuates the storytelling. And it's also very clear as to why you felt the need to thank all of these women that you intersected with at the very beginning, because that part of the story is so beautifully told. This is a story about discovery. What happened to your mother, how she dealt with that. Could you share just a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, I'll tell just a little bit of Mom's story, and some of which I knew almost right away when she revealed, that I had this sister, and some of which I didn't learn until I was doing the research for the book. So my mother was a junior at the University of Minnesota in the spring of 1960. Yes, there she is. She was, by her own account, this is her own account, she was not a particularly serious student. She enjoyed her time at the university. She had kind of come into a social renaissance, a personal social renaissance. She was very, very attractive. This photo here that we see is her participating in the Miss Engineering Day beauty pageant in 1960. So just about the time she was learning that she was pregnant. So to make the longer story short, she had a brief relationship with a man who was her older brother's friend. And it was her first sexual experience, and she got pregnant. And when she told him that she was pregnant, he wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. So she was on her own. She decided to finish out her classes that spring, and she was so mortified at the situation in which she had found herself, and so afraid to tell her friends and her family, that her first inclination, and what she did, was she hopped on a Greyhound bus and headed to San Francisco. Her first plan was to head across country and relocate, not tell anybody what had happened, and she was going to raise her baby by herself in San Francisco. She gets out there, she stays at the YWCA for a couple of days. She starts looking for a job, and she is just overcome with loneliness and overwhelm. And she decides she can't do that it would be better to kind of face the fallout at home in the company of her family and friends. So she turns around, comes home, tells her parents that she's pregnant. It does not go particularly well. And so the three of them somehow decide that she should hide out in the room under the eaves of their story-and-a-half house for 6 months, because it was such a shameful thing to be single and pregnant. So she stayed inside for about 6 months and kind of didn't set foot outside. And then decides to go to Booth. By her own account, she had made the arrangements with Booth. It wasn't her parents. It wasn't anybody else. She did. So she shows up at Booth New Year's Eve on 1960. She stays there for a couple of other weeks. This is just at the peak of the maternity home movement. Booth is filled with young women who are also in trouble. And
Before we get to that, Kim, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I put up the photo? I just want to be clear on sort of who your mother is in the photo. Allison, could you do me a favor? Could you put the photo back up?
Oh, this one. She is on my screen on the left with the black gloves. So she was the runner-up. Yes, I'm sorry. I should have clarified that. She is the runner-up in the Miss E Day pageant that day. Yeah.
And you were just about to share some of the history of Booth Hospital at that time sorry I had to interrupt you there, but I just wanted to make sure that the audience knew who your mother was in the photo.
Yep,
so could you tell us a little bit more about Booth Hospital?
Yeah, so when Mom got there, she was there in early 1961. That is really the peak of the maternity home movement for predominantly white, single pregnant women across the country and at Booth, St. Paul in particular. So it is during 1961 that Booth was a home and a hospital. So young pregnant women could go and stay there. They would wait out their pregnancies, but they could also deliver their babies at Booth, which was unique in the maternity homes in the metro area. And at that point, they were at almost 100% capacity. There's Booth. It's still there. It's on Como Avenue in St. Paul. It's now run as something else, but the Salvation Army still runs it. And so when Mom was there, she's experiencing this with a lot of other young women across the country. This is also kind of just after the peak of the baby boom in 1957, which we all know about. But sometimes what we don't realize is that 1957 was also the year that the number of, quote, illegitimate pregnancies and births had peaked at 200,000 for the first time as well. So alongside this kind of marital baby boom is this swelling number of young single women who are getting pregnant as well. And that's when she was at Booth. So there was something like, 440 children born at Booth the year that my sister was born as well.
Wow. I always love reading books and coming across those bits of information that you just shared. It really helps us put into context sort of understanding our present day reality, and also just to better understand the stories, folks, as well. I want to yield the floor and allow you now to bring up to the virtual stage here a couple guests and to let us all listen in on the conversation that you will have at this point in time. Again, for those of you, if there are questions that you have for Kim, please put those in the chat. I will come back in about 20 minutes or so, and then I will submit your questions to Kim so we can make sure that she gets a chance to hear from you as well now.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. And here we are. All right, so these are my special guests. These are the people you really want to come and hear, I can guarantee you. So in the upper, I assume that you're all seeing the same thing on your screen that I am. Well, you see names too. So Kim Sr. is my sister, the woman who found my mother and her mother in 1994 and who shares my name. So our brother Eric has made lots of jokes about, my sister Kim and my other sister Kim, for those of you who remember Newhart out there. So Kim is going to be joining us, as is Mary. Mary is one of the women that I interviewed for the book, who also delivered her baby at Booth Memorial Hospital in 1965. So I'm going to just kind of lead Kim and Mary through a conversation here about their experiences. And before I do that, I want to highlight one other historical fact that is so relevant to everybody's experience here, to my mother's, to Mary's, and of course, obviously to Kim's. And that is that at the time that my mother was at Booth, and so many women across the country, white women across the country, were at these maternity homes, The absolute most common plan, if you want to use that word, result of these of the babies who were born in these maternity homes was that these women more often than not relinquished them for adoption. 70% of women who were at Booth St. Paul at this time relinquished their babies for adoption, which is a very different thing than the first 3 or 4 decades of Booth's existence, when the emphasis was on keeping mother and child together. So the book talks about the reasons for that change, and that might come up in our conversation as well, or maybe in the Q&A. But the other thing that's happening at this time that Mom is at Booth is that there's this enormous trend, sometimes coerced, sometimes voluntarily undertaken, for single pregnant white women to relinquish their babies for adoption. So that's part of the story that we'll talk about here today as well. So I'm going to start with you, Mary, since we were just talking about Booth, and you had an experience very similar to my mother. Yes. And so I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about your connection to Booth and how you came to deliver your baby there.
Okay, well, I won't go back too far, but shame, of course, was the overriding cloud that we all lived under. It came from our family. It came from society. You didn't even question it. It was just an absolute thing that this must be kept secret at all costs. I was raised in a very small community, farming community, where everyone knew everyone else and their business. And I was 20 years old when I got pregnant. I had been dating this fellow for a couple of years and had finally relinquished, and he promised he would use precaution, and of course he did not. And so soon after I discovered I was pregnant. I'm not sure how I found the doctor, but I found a doctor, and I remember walking up the flight of stairs to his office, and after his exam, him telling me, "I'm pretty certain you're a couple months pregnant." So coming down the flight of stairs, I remember thinking, how can I end this? Because it can't go on. I can't possibly do this. And so my plan was, his office emptied out on a busy street corner in Minneapolis. And I thought if I could just wait until a bus came barreling down through the intersection and walk out in front of it, I could take my life and it would be over. So that was my plan. And I don't know how many buses I stood through, but I think about 8 or 10 buses later, it dawned on me that I didn't have the courage to do this, that I would have to make another plan. So I never saw another doctor the rest of my pregnancy. And so I decided I too was going to have to find a way to run away. And I stayed in my family's home. My mother and 3 sisters, we shared a home in Minneapolis at that time. My mother had always had this, this saying she would put out to us, given 4 teenage daughters. And she would always say, if any one of my daughters gets pregnant, I will find the guy and shoot him, and then I'll deal with her later. And my mother had attempted suicide at that point, and I knew she was capable of some pretty unpredictable behavior. So the idea of sharing this with them was just not possible. So I made up a story about going on a trip across the country, on a training trip. I would be a trainee for a company that was going to teach me about how they did whatever business they did. And I would be gone 4 to 5 months. I wasn't sure. And so that was fine. They accepted it as truth at the time, at least no one has said otherwise since. And so I stayed home as long as I could until the girdle wouldn't conceal my problem anymore. And then I went and found a tiny room over by the university that I could move into. And I'll never forget, the best room in the house was the bathroom. It was also the smallest room, but it had this wonderful old clawfoot bathtub, deep soaking kind of bathtub. And I really don't remember what I did with my time there for 4 months I was there. I know I didn't write because I couldn't have any memories to take with me. And I don't remember having books. I do remember taking at least 2 baths a day, maybe more, because it was a way to calm myself and relax. So I'm also not sure how I found Booth, but when I found them, I understood what you explained earlier, that girls could go there and live during their pregnancy, but I also found out in talking with them that you could be sent out to live with a family in the community that needed childcare or housekeeping or whatever. And that was an option you had as opposed to staying in the hospital. But I wasn't clear that you would have the choice. It sounded to me like they would decide if you were going, and I couldn't buy that because I was sure that somebody would see me that knew me, or I would know someone, and it just wouldn't work. So I decided I would just go there for giving birth. And I went there when my water broke. I was staying pretty close at the time. I went there when my water broke and was taken directly to the delivery room. And Booth made a practice of bringing resident doctors from the University of Minnesota to deliver the babies. And it turned out my birth was going to be a breech birth. And so the resident told me I would have to have a cesarean, and they were prepping to do that. And I said, no, stop, we're not doing that. And he said, well, it could be pretty bad if you don't. You or your baby or both of you may not survive. And I said, that's fine. We're not having a cesarean. And at that point, I sensed a change in his demeanor, and he was no longer on my side. He was almost challenging me to do it. And I don't know how many hours I was in labor, but it was a very long time. At a certain point, his shift was over and another resident came in. And I heard him talking behind the white screen to say something like, well, she's really a headstrong one. She thinks she doesn't have to have a cesarean for this breech. So I'm not sure what's going to happen to either one of them, but good luck. They're yours. And the awful shame that brought at the time, I'll never forget, because I was such a helpless person at that point. But there was always something good, isn't there? And there was a nurse that stayed with me and held my hand. And she promised me she wouldn't leave me until it was over. And bless her heart, she didn't. She stayed with me through both shifts. And I asked her if she would please not show me the baby because I didn't want to see him or smell him or whatever. And she did that for me as well. So it finished. I don't remember getting well, but I know I'd lost a lot of blood and they didn't give me a transfusion. So I do remember that was an issue. I was too weak. And so they kept me there for a few days. And when I was ready to go home, I could call a taxi and go back to my room, which I did. I stayed there for a few more days until I felt better. And then I called a taxi and went back home to my home, my family, who I had been calling. I would go down once or twice every 2 weeks and to a phone booth after dark that was by my room and call my family and be in my cheeriest voice and tell them what a good time I was having. I was learning so much. It was just great. And so I called a cab and went back to the airport, and they were to meet me at the airport. They met me at the airport, and Mary was back home, and my life just picked up from there. And 37 years of absolute silence, never telling a soul.
Yes, very similar to Mom. 33 for her, 37 for you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about because you went on to get married?
I did.
And you and your husband did not have children, were not able to have children. Can you tell me a little bit about how it was then that you did finally release your secret?
Well, my husband and I, of course, when I relinquished my son, I told myself I'll have more babies. I'll have 1, 2, or 3 more. It'll be easy. But unfortunately, my husband and I were not able to have children. So we sought out a therapist who specialized in infertility, because the divorce rate in infertile couples is very high. And so we met this wonderful woman who is still my therapist as of today, and started working with Lynn. And we worked with her for, probably 4 or 5 years. And still nothing. I had not told anyone anything. And I was in her office one day sitting in the chair, and I remember listening to myself tell my story. It just came out. And there was one side of my head that was saying, wait a minute, we didn't plan this way. This isn't supposed to happen. And the other side was so convinced and so ready to get out of that shame and move on. She just kept saying it. And when I was done, my therapist was looking at me like, really? And she just calmly looked at me and said, Mary, will you please tell me that story one more time? And so without a hint of emotion, I did, because the disassociation I had learned in those 37 years was pretty polished. And so it took a long, long time for me to trust telling anyone else. She asked me to join a women's group, which I did, but it was 2 years before I dared share my secret in the women's group. And then it was another 2 years after that before I told a friend. And she gave me the assignment of going out into my friendship circle and finding 4 people to tell. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done next to the birth, but it was pretty difficult. And I'm sure people weren't, they weren't in tune with where I had been. It seemed so unlikely. The worst part, of course, was telling my husband, and he reacted very poorly and nearly cost our marriage. And there was talk of suicide, and things were pretty dark for a long time. Mm-hmm. And finally, I think time takes care of some things. We moved through it somehow. It was not easy, but we moved through it. And with the help of some fabulous counseling, we were able to get to the other side. And I got far enough into my therapy to understand what I was doing to myself, carrying this shame. My therapist told me, your situation is not uncommon, not in 1965, as you were just saying, is very common. But the uncommon thing was the way you carried it. So the secret is really what has to be worked on here. So after a lot of therapy and a lot of hard work, I was able to start forgiving myself and be more open with some of the people I would tell. I still have many friends that are 3rd and 4th tier friends that have no idea of this. And in the beginning, you want to tell it to the world because you're so proud that you finally released it. But then you realize that it's still something that needs protection in some way. Yeah. But as evidenced by me being here with you tonight, I obviously have made great progress and continue to. And I think this situation and this opportunity with you, when I first met you, there was a very strong connection, and it's played out in not the way I thought, but it certainly has been, as I thought it would be, a piece of my healing when I sat down with you that day in the library and talked on and on for an hour, told you my story.
Well, and I imagine, and Kim, we're coming to you here in a second too, but I would imagine, as was the case for my mom, that part of that healing perhaps had to do with your finding your son, because you have reunited with your son. That is correct.
Yeah. Yes, that's the brightest spot of the story, is that I put in a letter in his file, and he responded that he would be open to being found. And so we discovered one another by mail for about a year or so. And then one day he suggested we meet in person, which more than takes your breath away. But I agreed to it. And of course, we met at a hotel here in Bloomington. I remember getting there early so I could get a chair and I could see the door. So I thought I could recognize him when he came in. And of course I could, and I did. And we spent the better part of 3 hours just sitting across from one another, looking in one another's eyes and continually, I'm sorry that I'm staring at you, but I feel like I'm looking at my own eyes. It was quite an experience. And he has brought grace and goodness to this relationship like I never would have expected. In my mind, he was the one person that had a right to be angry, and he had no anger issues whatsoever. And Meg, who was my social worker at Children's Home Society, who handled the adoption, told me that after her first conversation with him. She called me and she said, Mary, you're one of the very lucky biological mothers that has a child that has no anger issues whatsoever. What a relief. And to this day, he and his wife are part of my family, and they welcome me with open arms. And he has been just, as I said, grace and goodness. Wonderful.
That's fantastic. So that's a good segue to Kim, because Kim has the story from the other angle of this whole thing, of being that child that was surrendered for adoption, sent off, from my mom's perspective into the great unknown with good hopes that she would have a good life and be raised by a family that will love her and give her every opportunity that mom felt that she could not do. And so, Kim, I'm going to turn it to you and ask you if you can just tell us a little bit about what it was for you to grow up adopted and how it was that you came to find our mom, your birth mom, our mom.
Okay. I always knew I was adopted. My parents told me right from the very beginning. I don't remember it. It was so early. And honestly, it just made me feel kind of special because it took my parents 2 years to get me, which is longer than usual. And whenever I would mention it to friends or anything, people were interested. They wanted to know about it. Like, wow, what's that like? So it just made me feel kind of special. When I was 18 years old, I had written a letter to the organization in Minnesota that facilitated my adoption and said, can I find out anything? This was 1979. So the answer was no. But you can write a letter and put it in your file. And so if anybody inquires about you from your birth family, then we can give them that letter. So that's what I did. And thank goodness I had a copy of that letter and put it in my drawer. And I didn't see it again until I was 33 years old. I had been married and divorced and married again and moved probably 5 or 6 times. So the information on that letter was useless because it was so old. So all I did was write another letter that said, hey, update my information. And I thought that would be the end of it. But lo and behold, the rules and the law had changed by then. This was like 1994, something like that. And so what I got back from them was a big packet of information that had all of the interview information from when my birth mother entered Booth, everything they took from her whole family. And the idea was that they were supposed to block any identifying information, such as last names, addresses, that kind of thing. And they did mostly, except for one place where they forgot to block out the last name. So I had the last name of my birth mother and her 3 brothers and her parents. And I thought, well, this should be doable. So one of the things they had sent me was, I think, a brochure for some sort of adoption searching organization by state. So I contacted the contact in Minnesota and hired this person to search. And with that information, she found my birth mother really, really quick, called her up. And that's a funny story that's in the book. But I finally talked to her. And the funny thing is, my husband and I were leaving for a family trip and from Michigan the next day. And we were going to be driving right through Minnesota past her house. So we stopped there and spent the whole day with her that next day. And I feel like I was a lucky one because you never know who you're going to get, right? It could have been anybody, but Sharon was so incredible and welcoming, and she had pictures. That's the first day we met right there. She had pictures of all of the families. She had written out a family tree, and as an adopted person, it was like a dream come true. I had never even ever thought that would happen. It was so cool. I saw somebody I was biologically related to for the very first time. And then she went off to tell her daughter and her son about me, which, you know, I told her I completely understand if you don't want to do that, but she was excited to do it. And so now I have all these other people, including my sister Kim. Who it's funny that we're both Kim, but that's just a total coincidence.
Because your adoptive parents named you Kim.
Yes.
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 Let's clarify.
Yeah. Sharon did not name me Kim. She named me something else. So it was just one of many coincidences. And it's funny to fit in this family and see that I really fit. Like although I had the world's greatest adoptive family, and I just lucked out big time with them, but now I have another family too. It's cool.
Yeah. And I remember Mom took me out to dinner. That it was in July of 1994, and we went to the Ground Round in Crystal. And I remember her, I was just blathering away about whatever was going on in my life. And hadn't really noticed that she was kind of nervous. She wasn't eating too much. And finally she said, Kim, I have something to tell you. And I, okay, what's that? And she just spilled the whole thing like in one big breath. Just when I was young, I got pregnant. I wasn't married. I had this baby and I gave her up for adoption, and I haven't told anybody. And now she's back and she's coming, next week to see you. And then the punchline was, oh, by the way, her name is Kim. But she was
That's
so
the picture
nervous.
of the day we all met right there.
That was it.
Guys.
That was when you came back the second time to meet the rest of the family. And she was so relieved. And I think my brother had much the same reaction. She had been worried that we would be upset about it, that we would feel, I don't know, betrayed, or that we would, participate in some of that shame-based behavior that she had been living with for all those years. And I remember just thinking, well, no, what's the problem? Why would I feel bad about it? And I think I told her as much, and I could just see her relax. Just like, oh, okay. And Mary, this reminds me of how we met, because I met Mary when I was still teaching at St. Kate's, and I was doing a talk about my research. This was, a number of years ago now. And I was doing a talk about my research, and I was telling the story about my mom. And, she had died by that time. And I was saying, I was really sorry I hadn't asked her all these questions. And Mary was in the audience that day at St. Kate's. And I think you might have even said something during the Q&A. And, we spoke for a little bit afterwards, because I was, I was just had all these questions about my mom and felt so bad that I hadn't asked them of her directly. And that's when Mary stood up and identified herself as somebody else who had had a similar experience and would be willing to share her story with me. So I would like to ask both of you a question, and you can decide if you want to answer it or not. And that is about the fathers involved in these situations. I think one of the key elements of the story of Booth Girls, both the book and the experience of so many young women across the country at this time, was how unequally the burdens of single pregnancy were distributed between the men and the women. For some, for obvious reasons, women carry pregnancies and have babies. But I wonder if either of you would be willing to comment on that issue.
Well, I can speak to it. As I mentioned, I came from a very small town where everyone knew everyone. So I knew as soon as my mother had my truth, my secret, that she could very well go back to that small community and spread it around. And then his parents would find out about it, and perhaps he had never told them. So I did contact him, and I said, I just want to warn you that my mother is a little unpredictable. I don't know if she will come up and tell people, and your parents, I just want to spare them that. If you haven't told them, maybe you should. And so that went on. And at a certain point, he asked me how I was. And I said, well, I've been doing some very hard work. It's been an awful, difficult time, a lot of anguish. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. I guess I just never thought about it again. as simple as that. I'm sorry, I never thought about it again. Yeah. And that's the unfair advantage that men are born with, is they can walk away. They can.
Yeah, they sure can. And mine walked all the way out of the country, never to be heard from again. My birth mother tried to contact him. He was just kind of a weasel, and I don't have very high opinion of him. He had a lot of years to go back and check on her and see how she was, and he was friends with her brother, which is how they met. So he just, left, and whatever. I'm not a fan. Not a fan.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So can you both speak to, and perhaps you have already, but where does now your reunion with your birth mother, where does that fit in your life now? What is your, and Kim, here I am. So that's partly the answer to this question, but where does that reunion fit into your life now?
Well, for me, it's just the coolest thing that happened to me, besides probably the birth of my child. I just feel so lucky to have known Sharon, who is a really special person, and have a brother and sister, which I never had before. And it's the best memory. I feel really lucky and blessed. And I know, but it could have turned out otherwise, because not everybody's ready for a reunion. And I was prepared for that, but it would have hurt, honestly. So I just feel lucky and glad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mary, you spoke a little bit already about what a big part of your life your son and his family are to you now.
Yes, and as I said, when I wasn't able to have more children, it was just devastating that I had relinquished the only child I'd ever have. And so when he came into my life with such grace and openness and welcoming, it was really about rebirthing in a way. And it's probably, it's so significant in my life. It's changed. He has done more to eliminate the layers of shame than anyone. And our experience and our time together are so easy. And I feel so blessed, because in a way, I have my son back again.
And your experience is referred to as secondary infertility, when so many, and I don't know offhand what the numbers are, but many women who came through these maternity homes in this era of shamed and silenced single pregnancies and had their babies and surrendered them for adoption, a fair number of them would go on and experience infertility in their subsequent attempts to have children. Which I can only imagine would add just another layer of stress and hardship to the whole, and one that I can relate to, right? So part of the story of the book is my struggle with infertility, my husband's, and the adoption of our son, and that was one of the other motivations behind the book, was seeing how my mother embraced my son like nothing I was prepared for. She was never a baby person. She described herself as distinctly not a baby person, whatever that means. And she was nervous. I remember her being nervous to meet, this grandson that was coming home. But she went into it gangbusters. And for the incredibly short period of time they had together, she was his biggest fan, his biggest supporter. She was the biggest help to me as I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a mother and how I was going to survive this change in my life. And I have to wonder if that wasn't partly because she knew she was grandmothering another woman's lost baby. I have to imagine that she had great empathy for my son's birth mother, and that she would have understood what my son's mother must have been experiencing, must have been feeling at the loss of her own son. So it was a real treasure to see my son and my mother and the amazing bonds that they were able to forge with all of this. So That was definitely a part of the story. So I think we do see some questions coming in from the audience. So if Kevin, I don't know, yep, there he comes. If he wants to come back in and toss some questions our way, I think we're ready.
If only I could run up on stage that quick in real life. Again, the book, fabulous book, Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. The first question that we have comes from Catherine, and she asked the question, did the mothers get a chance to hold their newborns? And did mothers assume a different name when they entered? Mary, you talked a little bit about that. Was that a choice or was that directed?
I think the mothers would obviously, in fact, in reading some of the other birth mothers that we interviewed, some of them did keep their babies or were with them for a day or two or hours. In my case, I pleaded with the nurse not to let me have sight of him or hold him or touch him, or smell him, because it would just make the decision so much harder. And I knew I didn't have a choice. So I would have had an option. I think, I don't know how long it would have gone on for, but no, I couldn't afford it.
Yeah. But it touched me about sort of the smell. My mother passed away, and I remember 4 or 5 years later still being in her house and going in her closet, and the smell, right, was still there, and it brought back such vivid memories for me. Kim, were you going to add something there?
Yeah, I was going to add something. I know my mom, Kim's mom, said in the essays that she wrote about this time period that I think she also tried to minimize her contact with this tiny little baby, because by her own accounting, she said that, that was her plan. She had decided before she went to Booth that she was going to relinquish her baby for adoption. But it's one thing to have a plan, and then it's another thing to enact that plan when you have a tiny little newborn. And so she, when she has written about that experience, she said, I counted her fingers and toes. She was this beautiful little baby. She named her Lynette. And then she said, I had to let her go for the same reason. Otherwise, it would have been too hard to be able to follow through on that plan. And the question about, did mothers assume a different name when they entered? I believe at Booth, they went by first name and last initial for the girls and women who were there a little bit longer than maybe Mary, you were. I know at other maternity homes across the country, sometimes they were given entirely different names, pseudonyms. Because again, this was such a shameful experience. And a lot of these girls and their families wanted to protect their privacy. They were coming to places like Booth from small towns where had their secrets been revealed, it would have been a real social cost for them. So the idea was that we're going to kind of, it's kind of like when you go into the military and everybody shaves their head. It's like a cleansing of that one identity, and you're going to be somebody else now. And the idea was that once these young women had surrendered their babies for the good of the baby and themselves, they would be able to go home and get back to their, quote, real lives and resume their lives. And there was so little thought to how difficult that was going to be for these young women, whether they had chosen to, have their children adopted kind of voluntarily or not. That's a tremendous loss.
Wow. So another question comes in from Laura. She asked the question, after seeing a play at the History Theater, which she believes was called Watermelon Hill, was that play loosely based on Booth, if you know?
It was not based on Booth. That was Linda Bach McKay. It was based on Linda Bach McKay's book, Shadow Mothers. And I believe that was based on the Catholic infant home. So at this time, kind of in the, post-World War II era, there were 3 maternity homes in the Twin Cities area. One was Booth, one was the Catholic infant home in St. Paul, and one was the Lutheran girls home in Minneapolis. So I believe Watermelon Hill was based on the Catholic infant home or the Catholic girls home.
Okay. Alyssa writes, this question is for any one of the 3 of you. Interested in knowing how you feel your story might impact the narratives in our society today, and how to support the importance of family preservation moving forward in our society. So again, how it might impact the narrative, and you all talked about sort of the shame and the stigma and surrounding such a situation. How do you think it might change this narrative today?
I'll start with this, and then Mary and Kim, you can jump in when you're ready. But I think one of the things that is so disheartening about this time period is that, you know, there was so much effort and emphasis by social workers, by doctors, by educators, by families, by everybody to emphasize adoption as the solution to the problem of illegitimacy and infertility. And so there were a lot of resources that went into the idea that everybody would be better off if we separated mothers and children. And the infertile couples who were struggling with their own hardship in a culture that so valued the nuclear family would be able to have a family. A single pregnant white woman whose path towards, you know, her own fulfillment had been temporarily derailed by this pregnancy would be able to pursue her life thereafter. And the child would be raised in a secure, economically secure, kind of viable family. That was the idea behind what is called the best solution. What is so disheartening is that there was so little attention given to funneling resources and effort and support to these young women who may have wanted to keep their babies. Right. And there was a book that came out in 1965 or 67, I think it is, by a University of Minnesota social work professor. The book is called Adolescent Girls in Trouble. And I think that's what it's called. And she made that exact point. She said that, look, you know, a lot of these young women, these girls would love to keep and raise their babies if they had the chance. Why aren't we focusing some of our attention and our resources on preserving families rather than separating them? And I think, you know, a lot of scholars and a lot of people would say, well, the answer is that there was this market for adoptable, particularly adoptable white babies. So I don't know, Kim or Mary, if you want to add anything to that.
I think Kim is unmuted there.
There
Must
we
be
go.
one of the extra sibling kind of things, no?
I didn't do it.
I always tease her now that I'm the big sister and I owe her a couple of beatings and she's got the middle child syndrome now and all this. But
There we go.
I think thankfully that a lot of those attitudes and seem so archaic now. So like that there was some psychological deep down born problem with these girls that made them get pregnant. And it just seems so ridiculous now. It's not how society thinks. I think it's changed a lot for the better. I think stories like mine, where it's a happy reunion for everybody, shows that it's not such a bad thing to have more open adoptions like there are now. You know, let everybody know who everybody is, and if they want to keep in touch, great. If they don't, okay. But it's not just a big gaping hole. I don't know. I think it's gotten better, thankfully.
All right. And all the shame that was accumulated in the years we were talking about seemingly has evaporated. It's not uncommon at all to listen to stories about young women if they are pregnant, not getting married, and they're going to keep their baby and raise it at home, and mom and dad are going to help, and it's just fine.
And no one's shocked about that.
Right. And now, of course, with birth control that's available, that changes the whole dynamic entirely for women and choices. So big shift.
And you know, I have to say something. I know we have another question here, but I have to say that as an adoptive mother, I also really believe in the value of family preservation. I built my family through adoption. I cherish that, but adoption is an imperfect solution that comes with loss in so many different ways and for so many different people. I think there is a place for it, but I think that it needs to be undertaken very openly and with the fullest possible consent and desire of the birth mother. It shouldn't be something that is coerced. It shouldn't be something that is pressured. It shouldn't be something that is driven by economic inequality. Right. It just shouldn't be. So, yeah.
So, Mary, question comes in from Kate. She says, I understand that many unwed mothers in homes like Booth wore fake wedding bands or said that they were widows.
Mhm.
Do you recall hearing anything along those lines?
No, but you see, I only went to Booth after my water broke, so I was, in the delivery room, and then they put me in a bed, and I recovered, and I left. So I literally never saw another girl there while I was there. Um, so I don't know that, but I can assume that and many other things were done just to try to. I mean, I remember reading in the book, Kim, I think, where the girls would put on their fake wedding bands and go down Como Avenue and visit the shops and pretend to be, married women. It's, oh, yeah.
So much subterfuge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Question comes in from A.M. Campbell. Kim, did you ever come across a story where the father stayed connected? I know very few Booth girls ended up keeping their babies. Could it have been because the fathers were in support? And then maybe not in support.
Yeah. Hi, Amanda. I'm trying to think of, there were, yes, one of the women I interviewed for the book did stay in touch in various ways with the father of the baby that she delivered at Booth. It didn't end up being a particularly harmonious situation for various reasons, but they did. And so the women that I interviewed for the book, most of them ended up, separated from their children. In this particular case, she stayed connected with the father of the baby, and then they had a subsequent child together. And some of the other research I looked at, those Kanopka interviews. So the social work professor in 1963 went into Booth Memorial Hospital and interviewed 33 young women who were at Booth, teenagers between 14 and 19, to learn what their plans were for the baby. And some of those young women at that time said that, yes, their boyfriends wanted to get married. Their boyfriend, sometimes it was the boyfriend saying, please, 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 let's keep this baby. We can do it. We can do it together. And it was the parents who said, oh, no, you two are too young. You cannot do that. So there were, I don't want to cast all men with the same brushstroke. There were men who were very supportive. There were men who stayed involved with their female partners and those children, whether or not the mothers kept the babies.
I think we have one more question from Catherine. If I wanted to reach out to my older brother, born at Booth in 1958, where would I start? It says mutual mother is deceased, and she was born in 1962.
If you know the agency that handled your older brother's adoption, that is where you would start. Booth was not an adoption agency. It did not handle the adoption. So in Kim's case, it was Anoka County that handled Kim's placement with her adoptive family, and that would hold those kinds of records. Booth does have some records about its residents and the children who were born there. They're rather difficult to get, as are many adoption records, including still adoptees' original birth certificates, which is a whole other issue. The Salvation Army National Archives in Alexandria, Virginia, does have some of those records. But if you are not the woman who gave birth there, or I think the adoptee, you need to get a court order. So, there's a lot. I would suggest it might not be a bad idea to consult an adoption attorney, might give you some ideas. CUB, the Concerned United Birth Parents group, is a wealth of information for birth parents, for adoptees, for any members of the adoption constellation who are interested in reuniting with their families. They're not a search agency, but they are just a fantastic support and information storehouse of information. So I would say if you know the adoption agency, start there. You can try the Salvation Army National Archives. That might involve some court orders, and then maybe reach out to something like CUB. And Kim Senior, you have a suggestion.
Well, yes, I was going to say I have been able to determine who my birth father is and his whole family. through doing an ancestry DNA test, which yielded a wealth of information. I haven't made contact with him, but I have learned a lot about that side of the family, which is really important to me. So if anybody, if he or somebody that he's closely related to and knows, like a child maybe, has done a test, then they would match you that way. So it's something to think about.
I think that's being used more and more in the adoption community now. It's a whole new ballgame with those kind of DNA sites.
Well, I think we have come to the end of our time tonight. Mary, such powerful story that you shared. Enjoy seeing all the comments in the chat. I think you've got a growing fan club. Kim Sr., we appreciate your contributions tonight. And there's definitely something going on there between the siblings. I don't know if there will be, what'd you say, you were going to push her down or take her clothes? I don't know what goes on between sisters.
She's going to steal my makeup, and then I'm going to beat her up. That's what's going to happen. Yeah.
Throwing it down, Kim.
That all sounds good. That all sounds good. Kim, thank you as well for your contributions tonight. Again, the book, Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, The Secrets That We Kept. I also want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for their contributions tonight, and then also for their support of Kim. St. Catherine's University as well for their contributions. Minnesota Independent Scholar Forum. I know in my conversations with Kim, she greatly appreciates their support in the development of this book. Lastly, Salvation Army and sort of the Booth House itself for opening up and being part of the story. And then the Historical Society and the Minnesota Humanities Center would also like to thank the generous funding made available to us to support artists, great artists like Kim, through the legacy funding that we receive. And therefore, thanks to all the taxpayers in Minnesota. Once again, please make sure that you go out and find Booth Girls, Pregnancy, Adoption, and the Secrets We Kept. I'm gonna have to get better. I don't know if I'm going to be ready for weather. But here's the book. Please go out and purchase it. A fantastic read. Thank you for joining us tonight. Again, Mary, Kim Sr., really appreciate you. And Kim, thanks again for writing such a great book.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
On behalf
Thank
of
you,
the Minnesota Humanities Center, Minnesota Historical Society, and Kim, thank you all for joining us tonight. Take care.